But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for, and he's probably spent more time thinking about it.
What happens when a royal silence is quietly broken? King Charles's cancer diagnosis stunned the nation, but it was Princess Anne's rare remark that shifted the public mood. As the king stepped back, Anne and Queen Camilla stepped forward, revealing a monarchy quietly adapting under pressure. What did Anne reveal that stirred so much reaction? How did Camilla hold the line in Charles's absence? And what does this mean for the monarchy's future? In the final days of January, a rare ripple broke through the polished stillness of Buckingham Palace. On the morning of 26 January, the palace issued a short, carefully worded statement. King Charles had been admitted to the hospital for treatment of an enlarged prostate. It was described as benign, and the operation was referred to as a routine corrective procedure. That word, benign, was meant to reassure. But in a monarchy that rarely shows its inner workings, even that much transparency felt unusual. There was no photo of the king, no live address from a family member, just a few lines typed out, released to the press, and then silence. But as always, silence inside the royal family means something is happening behind the scenes. It was not just the king's health that drew attention, but the way the palace approached it. The brief statement marked one of the few times in recent history that such a personal detail about a reigning monarch had been shared so publicly. To many, it suggested that the condition, though non-cancerous, was serious enough to warrant early disclosure. As speculation grew, it wasn't a press secretary or physician who gave the public its next clue. Instead, it was the monarch's sister, Princess Anne. Known for her discretion and distaste for drama, Anne rarely comments on anything outside of her royal duties. She has spent decades fulfilling hundreds of annual engagements without seeking the spotlight. Yet days after the king's admission, as she appeared at a low-key military event in Scotland, she was briefly stopped by reporters. When asked about her brother, she paused for just a moment before offering a response that was as measured as it was quietly jarring. She said, "It's a bit of a wake-up call, I think." That was all. But it was more than enough. Her tone wasn't alarmist, but it wasn't dismissive either. And coming from Anne, a figure who seldom editorializes, it landed heavily. Within hours, her remark was running across UK headlines and international news tickers. It was the first time someone from within the family had hinted that King Charles's condition may carry more weight than the official line suggested. In the days that followed, royal commentators began to dig deeper. Was the condition worse than reported? Was the king's public schedule a reflection of his true state, or simply a strategic image? Several major newspapers began to note the absence of updates. The king, now in hospital for a few days, had not been seen. Some questioned why the palace had taken so long to reveal the condition in the first place. For a monarchy built on carefully timed appearances and messaging, the delay itself became part of the story. Princess Anne, meanwhile, returned to her standard duties. She said no more, but her brief comment continued to echo through press rooms and royal circles alike. Whether she intended to draw attention or simply spoke honestly in the moment, the effect was undeniable. For the first time since the king's diagnosis was made public, the royal family appeared less united in its message. On 29 January, King Charles was discharged from the London clinic. He was photographed briefly leaving the hospital, accompanied by Queen Camilla. His expression was pleasant, even smiling, but observers noted that he looked thinner. He waved to the public before getting into the car, and the footage was circulated widely across television and social media. Once again, the palace issued a short statement. The king was in good spirits and progressing well. Still, something had shifted. The images, while reassuring in some ways, only raised more questions. Why was the king not speaking himself? Why had no family member besides Anne acknowledged the condition directly? Why had Anne chosen to comment at all? While these questions swirled outside the gates, the royal family was tightening its own boundaries. Queen Camilla made several solo appearances in the week following the king's hospitalization. At one event, when asked directly about the monarch's health, she responded with a brief, "He's doing fine, thank you." It was a common enough answer, but it carried a kind of strain. One royal correspondent described her demeanor as composed but protective. Privately, it was reported that Queen Camilla had taken on more responsibility than usual. Royal watchers noted that she was not only standing in for events, but also coordinating much of the king's schedule from behind the scenes. Palace insiders described her as deeply involved and quietly anxious. During the same period, Princess Anne's calendar grew busier. Without ceremony or announcement, she picked up additional public duties, events that might previously have fallen to the king himself. A royal analyst noted that Anne had shifted from a background figure to a stabilizing one simply by maintaining presence. "She does what needs to be done," one former courtier commented, "and in times like this, that means more than ever." Still, even Anne's steadiness couldn't hide the growing uncertainty. Behind the walls of the palace, tension was building, not just because of the king's health, but because of how much of it had now become public. The press was asking harder questions, and Princess Anne's one-sentence comment had opened the door to a wave of speculation. A few days later, she made another appearance, this time at a veterans' charity in Manchester. She looked composed as always, dressed in a tailored coat and her signature pinned hair. When a journalist again asked how the king was doing, she offered only a polite nod and moved on. But the damage, from the palace's point of view, had already been done. The situation grew more complicated when several senior aides began privately expressing frustration. According to one political editor, some inside the palace believed Anne had stepped outside of protocol. Royal communications are typically centralized, carefully worded, and rarely spontaneous. Anne's remark, however brief, was not cleared in advance. And while she may have spoken from concern, it challenged the tightly managed image of the king's recovery. The palace continued to issue minimal updates. They described the king's condition as stable, and his engagements as being temporarily postponed. Still, behind that controlled narrative, something more personal was taking shape. For a monarch known for his attention to detail and desire for order, this moment of public vulnerability was deeply unsettling. And for a sister who had watched her brother take the throne later in life, after decades of waiting, it marked a turning point neither had anticipated. As February approached, the family found itself balancing two competing forces: the need for privacy and the public's growing demand for clarity. And in the middle of it all was Anne, unshaken, present, and increasingly central. She hadn't revealed any diagnosis, nor had she criticized the palace. But her words had done something rare. They had made the royal family feel real, concerned, human, and at least for a moment, unguarded. As February settled in, the royal household tried to return to a sense of normalcy, at least on the surface. King Charles, recently discharged from the London clinic, was said to be recovering at Sandringham. The official updates were minimal. He was described as resting well and in good spirits. But behind those sparse bulletins, the dynamics inside the royal family were still quietly shifting. The king had not been seen publicly since leaving the hospital. His duties, which were already being scaled back before his procedure, had now been delegated further. Instead of resuming high-profile engagements, his presence was replaced by video calls and private briefings. Though this wasn't unusual given his age and the nature of the procedure, the silence still felt weightier than expected. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla was stepping into more visible roles. At several public events during early February, she maintained the grace and calm the public had come to associate with her. When asked about the king's health, her response was always concise. "He's doing well, thank you," she repeated on more than one occasion. While she delivered the line with sincerity, those watching closely noticed her guarded tone. Behind the carefully selected words was a sense of responsibility that had suddenly grown heavier. Royal commentators began to point out that her presence, while reassuring, also served a deeper function. She was now the face of continuity in the king's temporary absence. Her appearances became more frequent, and each one seemed to carry a subtle message. The monarchy was functioning, even if its figurehead was temporarily out of sight. And just as she was taking on more of the external duties, Princess Anne remained firmly in the spotlight as well, though in a different capacity. She didn't issue any more public comments about her brother's condition. In fact, she seemed to deliberately avoid saying anything further. But her actions spoke just as loudly. Her calendar remained packed with engagements across the country. Agricultural shows, veteran charities, naval commemorations. She moved from one to the next without fuss, as she always had. What changed now was the way the media portrayed her. Previously seen as the most dutiful yet least discussed royal, Anne was now gaining headlines not just for her workload, but for her steadiness during this uncertain period. Royal observers noted how she'd become, intentionally or not, a grounding presence in the middle of a slowly unfolding health crisis. One royal correspondent commented in an editorial, "She's doing what the public needs to see, showing up, holding steady, and not making a scene." In moments like this, Anne becomes more than a working royal. She becomes a symbol of continuity. Within the palace, however, that continuity came with its own pressures. There was growing tension around how the narrative of the king's health was being managed. While the palace's official messaging remained minimal, media speculation was beginning to fill the void. Some outlets began re-examining previous royal health announcements, drawing comparisons and suggesting that this situation might be more serious than initially presented. That speculation was further intensified by whispers of internal frustration. According to sources familiar with the palace environment, there was concern among senior aides about the limited control over the narrative. Though Anne had only spoken briefly weeks earlier, her words had opened the door to questions the palace wasn't ready to answer. The concern was not necessarily over what she had said, but rather the effect it had. For a royal family built on the power of silence and symbolism, even a simple sentence like, "It's a bit of a wake-up call," was enough to disrupt the narrative equilibrium. A senior commentator noted, "Anne has never been reckless, but she's also not afraid of honesty, and that can be inconvenient for a palace that still believes in silence as strength." As these tensions simmered, the king remained out of the public eye. He reportedly continued receiving his red boxes, those daily briefings from government ministers, while staying at Sandringham. But public interest wasn't fading. The combination of a monarch recovering, a sister taking on increased visibility, and a queen consort filling the public void created a dynamic the British public hadn't seen in years. In mid-February, Princess Anne attended a veterans fundraiser in Gloucestershire. This time, she was more guarded with the press. When a reporter called out a question about King Charles, she didn't pause or respond. She simply moved through the event with her usual efficiency. Yet, her presence there once again reminded observers of the increasingly important role she was playing. Outside the palace, royal analysts began speculating about the longer-term implications. Some questioned whether the king's workload would be permanently reduced. Others wondered if this marked the beginning of a slow transition toward delegating more responsibility to senior family members like Prince William and Princess Anne. Public discussion wasn't about abdication, not even close, but it was about the realism of expectations. After all, King Charles had waited longer than any heir in British history to assume the throne. Now, only months into his reign, his health was taking center stage. It was a reminder that longevity and service are not the same, and that royal responsibility is increasingly becoming a shared one. Throughout this period, the palace remained disciplined. Official communications focused on gratitude for public support, the king's appreciation for hospital staff, and vague assurances of continued recovery. But as one political journalist put it, the statements are so polished they feel sterile. People want to know how their monarch really is, and that hunger for truth is growing. That moment of honesty, whether planned or not, left its mark. Princess Anne returned to her duties, saying no more, but walking firmly through the uncertainty that still hung over the monarchy. And though the king was resting, the royal household was still in motion, with its most enduring members carrying the weight of tradition forward, step by step. By mid-February, The atmosphere around the royal household had grown heavier, even as the official tone remained composed. King Charles was no longer in hospital, but there was still no clear return to a regular public schedule. Though the palace continued to express gratitude for the well wishes he had received, the underlying reality became clearer as a new and more serious announcement emerged. On 5th February, Buckingham Palace released a statement that would change the tone of the entire conversation. Following his hospital treatment for an enlarged prostate, King Charles had been diagnosed with a form of cancer. The palace clarified that it was not prostate cancer, but it had been discovered during the king's treatment and would now require further medical intervention. It was a rare moment of transparency for the monarchy, and one that carried immediate weight. What stood out just as much as the content of the announcement was the decision to reveal it at all. For a royal family historically known for guarding personal health matters, the choice to go public with the diagnosis marked a shift in tone. A palace spokesperson stated that the king himself had chosen to disclose the news to reduce speculation and to encourage public discussion around health. He reportedly hoped that others would seek treatment early and feel less stigma around serious conditions. In the days that followed, there was a significant wave of public sympathy. Support poured in from across the United Kingdom and beyond. Political leaders, international figures, and ordinary citizens expressed concern and admiration for the king's openness. The news dominated headlines, and royal correspondents immediately began to assess the implications for both the monarch and the institution. For the first time since ascending the throne, King Charles was now navigating the most personal of battles in full public view. While the palace did not specify the type or stage of cancer, they made it clear that the king had begun outpatient treatment and would be postponing public engagements for the time being. He would continue with state business and paperwork, but appearances would be limited. The idea of a reigning monarch undergoing cancer treatment while remaining in office raised questions the palace was not eager to entertain, but the public began asking them nonetheless. In the middle of this renewed attention, Princess Anne kept to her schedule. As expected, she did not issue any statements or offer new commentary. Her role during this time was not vocal but visible. She attended military events, charity fundraisers, and community gatherings. Her presence, as always, was low-key but consistent. It was the same rhythm she had followed for decades. Yet now, each event carried more symbolic weight. Observers noted that Anne had become a constant figure during a period of instability. She wasn't stepping in for the king in any official capacity, but her steady participation in royal life became a quiet reassurance to the public. There was no dramatic shift in her duties, no headline-making move. She simply continued to show up day after day, event after event, demonstrating that while the monarchy was facing an uncertain chapter, its foundations were still active. Inside the palace, the king was said to be focusing on treatment and staying closely connected to his advisors. Reports from those close to the family indicated that Charles was in regular communication with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and that he remained deeply engaged with national matters. But his physical absence from the public eye left a noticeable gap, and his family members were, once again, stepping into the frame. Queen Camilla remained publicly visible and, according to reports, had taken on a key emotional role in supporting the king. Her schedule adjusted as needed, but she was still attending events, issuing brief comments when asked, and keeping a steady tone. Though the palace did not go into detail, it was understood that she had become the king's closest confidant during treatment, offering both personal support and a public bridge. In the days following the cancer announcement, the British media reframed their coverage. While earlier reporting had focused on hospital visits and absence from engagements, the conversation now turned toward resilience and duty. Many headlines praised the king's honesty. Others began to examine the long-term implications. Would there be a need for a regency in the future? Was this a temporary pause or a sign of a slower, more scaled-down monarchy? Through it all, Princess Anne remained the least discussed but most photographed senior royal. Her image, appearing in regional newspapers and national broadcasts, became synonymous with stability. At one agricultural event in early February, she was captured laughing with local farmers, offering handshakes and brief remarks without any reference to her brother's health. The images were understated, yet they told their own story. While much of the monarchy was recalibrating, she had simply continued. Royal watchers took notice. One commentator on a morning news program remarked, "Anne has always been there. What's different now is that the public is paying closer attention. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, they're seeing just how essential she really is." Meanwhile, conversations about succession and shared responsibility grew louder in media circles, though the palace made no mention of any changes to the king's formal role. The emphasis remained on continuity, on the idea that the king was still very much in charge, even if physically more limited. But for many, this period marked the beginning of a slow, perhaps inevitable, shift toward a more distributed monarchy. That shift wasn't only about Charles. It was also about who was showing up in his absence. While Prince William had been involved in several engagements during this period, much of the daily royal presence came from Anne and Camilla. Neither were substitutes for the monarch, but both were deeply familiar to the public and increasingly associated with keeping the royal machinery running. And still, Princess Anne said nothing more. She did not clarify her earlier remark. She did not offer new insight into her brother's condition. She simply went where she was scheduled to go, arriving on time, dressed with precision, and carrying out her duties with quiet dignity. As March began, the monarchy found itself navigating a new phase, one that demanded quiet resilience rather than ceremony. King Charles had started his outpatient cancer treatment and continued to receive government briefings, but his absence from public life was now deeply felt. While he remained committed to state duties, his physical presence was deliberately reduced, and the palace made it clear this would continue for some time. In his place, the rhythm of royal life was maintained by those closest to him. Queen Camilla, already a steady presence, now took on even more. She represented the king at key national events and issued brief reassurances whenever asked about his health. Her public comments remained limited, carefully scripted, but they helped fill the silence. At the same time, her consistency became a visible signal that the institution was not standing still. Princess Anne continued her own schedule, unchanged but newly significant. While her activities weren't headline-grabbing, they carried a weight of their own. She visited regional communities, attended military commemorations, and presided over charitable engagements. With each appearance, she reminded the public that service wasn't defined by visibility alone. It was the act of showing up, over and over again, that had long defined her role, and never more so than now. Though Anne made no public remarks following the king's diagnosis, her presence in the spotlight had increased naturally. Royal watchers began to point out that, without saying a word, she was setting a tone. Her engagements were not ceremonial fillers. They were proof that the monarchy's work continued beyond the headlines. For a family facing a sensitive and personal crisis, Anne's consistency offered something of a public anchor. At a naval event in early March, her arrival was met with quiet applause. Dressed in a dark coat and with her usual understated style, she moved through the ceremony with the same precision that had defined her for decades. Reporters covering the event made note of how engaged she was, speaking with veterans, acknowledging volunteers, and offering words of thanks. Nothing unusual for Anne. But this time, the coverage lingered longer than usual. Her photo was featured across several national outlets the following day, with captions praising her quiet strength. Inside the palace, a subtle but important dynamic was taking shape. With the king physically limited, Queen Camilla and Princess Anne had, without fanfare, become the institution's primary faces. This wasn't a formal redistribution of roles, nor did it imply any change to succession. But it reflected a broader reality, that the monarchy was now relying more on its most experienced members to carry the daily burden of public life. Royal analysts began drawing comparisons to previous times in history when illness or transition had shifted responsibilities within the royal household. What was different now was the openness with which the situation was being handled. The palace had not detailed the king's treatment, but the admission of a cancer diagnosis itself was unprecedented in its transparency. That decision had changed the tone of the public conversation, replacing speculation with measured concern and allowing the focus to shift to how the monarchy would function in his stead. It was during this time that attention began to turn more directly to the question of future leadership. While there was no suggestion that King Charles would step down or reduce his formal duties permanently, the situation highlighted the importance of preparation. Prince William, next in line to the throne, was quietly being positioned to take on more strategic visibility, though in a way that didn't overstep or draw attention away from his father. But even as the narrative shifted towards succession, Princess Anne's role remained firmly rooted in the present. She was not part of any transition plan, nor was she involved in long-term strategic discussions. Her focus was immediate, continuing the day-to-day visibility of the royal family, while others managed internal adjustments. Observers continued to note how Anne's presence filled the void left by the king's absence in a way few others could. Her relationship with the public was not based on glamour or spectacle. It was built on decades of unchanging service, a point that many commentators began to revisit in opinion columns and broadcasts. One article described her as the steady hand of the monarchy, while another praised her ability to reassure the public simply by showing up. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla maintained her schedule with equal steadiness. At a Commonwealth Day service held without the king in attendance, she appeared composed, delivering brief remarks and participating in the ceremony as the highest-ranking royal present. Her presence there symbolized continuity, but it also subtly acknowledged the shifting responsibilities within the family. She had long been a supportive figure beside Charles, but now she was taking on a more independent public role. Throughout March, this adjusted configuration of the royal household began to feel more familiar. The press, initially fixated on Charles's absence, began to normalize the presence of Anne and Camilla as lead figures. At the same time, palace sources continued to insist that the king was being kept well-informed, involved in decision-making, and dedicated to resuming public duties once his treatment allowed. Still, no timeline was given. The palace remained cautious in its messaging, sharing only what was necessary and leaving much unsaid. It was clear that the king's recovery was the priority, but also that the royal household was determined to manage the optics with minimal disruption. In that effort, Princess Anne's continued visibility proved critical. She did not replace her brother, nor did she speak for him. But she provided a kind of continuity that could not be manufactured. Her actions during this period weren't framed as dramatic or transformative. They were familiar and consistent. And in moments of uncertainty, that kind of familiarity is often the most powerful tool an institution can offer. The focus of public attention gradually began to shift from the intensity of King Charles's diagnosis to the quiet resilience of the institution itself. With Queen Camilla and Princess Anne taking on additional public responsibilities, and Prince William maintaining his usual balance between royal duty and family life, the monarchy appeared to find its footing again. There were no sweeping announcements, no visible change in command. But what unfolded during this time was a portrait of adaptation, of individuals stepping forward, not to replace, but to reinforce. Behind the scenes, the king continued his treatment while remaining engaged in daily state affairs. The palace confirmed he was receiving regular government briefings and maintaining correspondence with ministers and officials. Though his public appearances had been paused, his influence within the institution remained intact. The decision to make his diagnosis public had reshaped how the monarchy interacted with its people, offering an unusual sense of openness. That choice was not without risk, but it had earned a degree of public trust that proved vital during this period of uncertainty. Observers began to recognize that this moment in the king's reign, though marked by challenge, had also revealed a softer form of leadership. Rather than disappearing into silence, he allowed the public to share in the reality of his health journey, without dramatics, without unnecessary detail, but with enough honesty to invite empathy. It was a shift in tone that reflected the modernizing intentions he had quietly promoted for years. For Princess Anne, the impact of this transition was clear in how the public now regarded her role. Her schedule hadn't changed dramatically, but the perception of her presence had. people were paying closer attention. Communities she visited responded with increased warmth and gratitude. Her appearances, once routine, had become small symbols of stability. And while she had not offered further comments since her early remark following the king's hospitalization, that silence now seemed deliberate, even meaningful. She had said enough, and her actions had done the rest. The same was true for Queen Camilla, whose appearances had increased but remained in keeping with the tone the palace wished to maintain, measured, composed, and focused on duty. Her presence at major events during this period was never designed to replace the king, but to ensure the continuity of representation. She filled the gaps with grace, allowing the public to feel that the royal household was still functioning as intended. Prince William, while present, remained somewhat on the periphery of this particular narrative. His role was steady, and his engagements continued as expected, but he was not pushed forward as a substitute. That too appeared to be a strategic decision, allowing the king space to retain his leadership while acknowledging the quiet strength of those around him. It was a balancing act that respected both tradition and realism. Throughout this time, the tone from the palace remained carefully consistent. There were no dramatic shifts, no overstated messages. The updates about the king's health were limited to what was necessary, often delivered through brief statements that offered little more than a reassurance that treatment was ongoing and spirits were high. It was a model of communication that echoed the tone set by the king himself, reserved but honest. As the initial intensity surrounding the diagnosis began to soften, the focus widened to include reflections on the broader royal structure. Analysts noted that while the monarchy had long relied on a strong central figure, this moment had shown the value of a dispersed, experienced support system. Individuals like Princess Anne, Queen Camilla, and Prince William weren't stepping out of their lanes. They were simply stepping forward when needed. This approach had proven effective not through any grand gestures, but through quiet, steady service. The monarchy, often criticized for being too rigid or detached, had shown that it could move with dignity through a moment of vulnerability. It had allowed its senior members to adapt naturally, without resorting to spectacle or overcorrection. And in that, perhaps, lay the clearest message of this chapter. Strength in the royal family did not come solely from titles or ceremonies. It came from the ability to show up consistently, responsibly, and without fanfare. It came from the willingness to support, to stand in without taking over, and to keep the public trust through action rather than rhetoric. King Charles had faced the most personal of challenges in a very public role, and in doing so, had given his reign a kind of grounded authenticity. The trust he placed in his family, particularly in Anne and Camilla, had reinforced the idea that the monarchy, though centuries old, could evolve in subtle but meaningful ways. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.